Metapsychological addition to the theory of dreams. Sigmund Freud. Metapsychological addition to the theory of dreams. We have repeatedly to see how advantageous it is for our research to compare certain states and phenomena with each other, which we can regard as normal models of certain pathological conditions. Certain affective states belong to this genre, such as grief and falling in love, and others of a different nature, among which we will cite the state of rest, sleep, and the dream phenomenon. When lying down with the purpose of sleeping, the man strips himself of all those wrappings that cover his body and of those objects that constitute a complement to his somatic organs or a substitution of parts of his body, that is, the glasses, the wig, false teeth, etc., and works equally with his psyche, renouncing most of his psychic acquisitions and thus reconstituting, in both directions, the situation that was to be the starting point of his vital development. Sleeping is, somatically, a return to the stay in the maternal womb, with all its characteristics of stillness, warmth, and absence of stimulation. Many men even take the fetal position during their sleep. The psychic state of the sleeper is characterized by an almost complete withdrawal from the surrounding world and the cessation of all interest in it. When we investigate psychoneurotic states, we are led to accentuate, in each one of them, the so-called temporary regressions, that is, the amount of regression that is particular to it, towards the earliest phases of development. We distinguish two of these regressions, the development of the ego and the development of the libido. The latter reaches, in the state of rest, until the reconstitution of primitive narcissism, and the former, until the phase of hallucinatory wish satisfaction. All that we know of the psychic characteristics of the state of rest we have ascertained in the study of dreams. These do not show us the man sleeping, but they cannot but reveal to us some of the characteristics of the state of rest. Observation has revealed to us some peculiarities of the dream phenomenon, which at first seemed unintelligible to us, but which we have since come to understand perfectly. Thus, we know that dreams are absolutely egotistical and that the person who plays the main role in their scenes is always the sleeper. This circumstance naturally derives from the narcissism of the resting state. Narcissism and egoism are the same thing. The only difference is that with the term narcissism we emphasize that egoism is also a libidinous phenomenon. Or put another way, narcissism can be considered as the libidinous complement of egoism. The diagnostic capacity of sleep is also understandable to us, which reveals to us, during rest, the symptoms of a disease in its beginnings, symptoms that went unnoticed during wakefulness. The dream phenomenon amplifies, in effect, to the gigantic, all the somatic sensations. This amplification is of a hypochondriac nature. It presupposes that all the psychic charge has been withdrawn from the external world and accumulated in the self, and allows one to discover in dreams somatic changes, which during wakefulness would have remained unnoticed for some time. A dream is the signal that something has arisen that tended to disturb the rest, and it tells us the way in which this disturbance can be rejected. The sleeper dreams instead of waking up under the effects of the disturbance, thus resulting in sleep a guardian of rest. Instead of the internal stimulus that aspired to attract the attention of the subject, an external event has arisen, the dream phenomenon, whose aspirations have been satisfied. A dream is, then, a projection abroad, of an internal process. We remember having already found projection in another place, among the means of defense. Also, the mechanism of the hysterical phobia culminated in the fact that the individual could protect himself, by means of escape attempts, against an external danger, arising instead of an internal instinctive stimulus. But we must defer the careful study of projection until we come to the analysis of that narcissistic condition in which this mechanism plays a major role. Let's see how the intention to sleep can be disturbed. The disturbance can come from an internal excitation or an external stimulus. First of all, we will attend to the less transparent and more interesting case of the disturbance emanating from the interior. Experience shows us that dream stimuli are remains of the day, mental charges that have not lent themselves to the general removal of charges and have retained, despite it, a certain measure of libidinous interest or of any other kind. Thus, we find here a first exception of the narcissism of the state of rest, an exception that gives rise to the dream making. The remains of the day make themselves known to us in the analysis, as latent dream ideas, and we have to consider them, by their nature and their situation, as preconscious representations, belonging to the PREC system. The subsequent elucidation of the formation of dreams is not without certain difficulties. The narcissism of the resting state means the removal of the charge from all objective representations, and both from the unconscious part of them and from their preconscious part. Thus, when we find that certain remains of the day have remained charged, we cannot be inclined to admit that they have acquired enough energy during the night to attract the attention of consciousness. Rather, we will assume that the charge they retain is much weaker than the one they had during the day. The analysis spares us here further speculation, showing us that these diurnal remnants have to receive a reinforcement, emanating from the unconscious instinctive sources, in order to emerge as dream makers. This hypothesis does not offer, at first, any difficulty, since we must assume that the censorship located between the PREC and INC is greatly diminished during rest, therefore, the relationship between both systems is greatly facilitated. However, an objection arises here that we cannot silence. If the narcissistic state of rest has resulted in the withdrawal of all the charges of the INC and PREC to the I, the theory of the formation of dreams shows, here, a. This is an obvious contradiction that we can only overcome by modifying our hypothesis on the narcissism of the resting state. This restrictive hypothesis is also irrefutably demonstrated in the precocious dementia, and its content can only be that the repressed part of the INC system does not obey the desires to sleep emanating from the ego, retains its charge, totally or fragmentarily, and conquers, as a result of the repression, some independence. Correlatively, a certain amount of the effort of repression, of the countercharge, would have to be maintained during the night, in order to avoid the instinctive danger, although the occlusion of all the paths that lead to the development of affection and motility must decrease considerably the level of necessary counterload. Thus, we would describe in the following way, the situation that leads to the formation of dreams. The desire to sleep tries to retract all the charges emanating from the I and to constitute an absolute narcissism. This purpose can only be half achieved, since the repressed system INC does not obey the desire to sleep. Therefore, a part of the countercharge has to be maintained as well, and the censorship between system incorporated and PREC. He must remain vigilant, although not as much as during the day. In the sphere of action of the I, all the systems are stripped of their charges. The stronger the unconscious instinctive charges are, the more incomplete the rest will be. There is also an extreme case, in which the I abandons its desire to sleep, because it feels incapable of limiting the impulses released during sleep, or in other words, it gives up sleeping for fear of its dreams. Later, we will appreciate in all its broad importance, the hypothesis of the disobedience of repressed impulses. For now, we will limit ourselves to continuing our examination of the formation of dreams. As a second exception to narcissism, we will note the aforementioned possibility that some of the preconscious daytime ideas also resist and retain a part of their charge. Both cases may be, basically, identical. The resistance of the remains of the day may depend on their connection, already existing in wakefulness, with unconscious impulses. But something less simple can also happen, that is, that the diurnal remnants, not totally stripped of their charge, are related to what is repressed, during the state of rest, thanks to the greater ease of communication between the PREC systems and INC. In both cases the same decisive progress of the dream formation takes place, that is, the preconscious dream wish is constituted, which gives expression, with the material of the preconscious day remains, to the unconscious impulse. This dream wish must be distinguished from the remains of the day. It did not exist in wakefulness, and it can already show the irrational character that everything unconscious manifests when we translate it into the conscious. The dream wish should not be confused with the optional feelings that may exist among the preconscious, latent, ideas of the dream. But when such desires appear integrated into said material, it becomes associated with them, intensifying them. Let us now examine the subsequent destinations of this optional impulse, representative of an unconscious instinctual tendency, which has formed, as a dream wish-fulfilling fantasy, in the PREC system. This impulse could find its satisfaction in different ways. It could follow what we consider normal during the wakefulness, that is, to pass from the PREC system to consciousness, or create a direct motor discharge, bypassing the CC system. But observation shows us that it follows a third path, totally unexpected. In the first case, it would become a delusional idea, the content of which would be the fulfillment of the wish, but this never happens during the state of rest. Although we are still very little familiar with the metapsychological conditions of mental processes, we can perhaps deduce from this fact that the total discharge of a system makes it insensitive to stimuli. The second case, that is, that of direct motor discharge, should be excluded by the same principle, since access to motility is normally beyond the censorship of consciousness, but it can occur, exceptionally, constituting somnambulism. We do not know under what conditions this possibility arises and why it is so infrequent. But what really happens in dreams is something as unique as it is unforeseen. The process born in the PREC and intensified by the INC system, it takes a regressive path through the INC system, in the direction of perception tending towards consciousness. This regression is the third phase of dream formation, and we describe it as topical, to differentiate it from the temporary one mentioned above. Both regressions do not necessarily coincide always, but they do in the present case. The regression of arousal from the PREC, even perception, through the INC system, is at the same time a return to the hallucinatory wish fulfillment phase. Through the interpretation of dreams, we learn how the regression of preconscious daytime remains in the dream making takes place. The ideas are transformed into images, predominantly visual, that is, the verbal representations are reduced to the corresponding objective ones, as if the whole process were dominated by the tendency to representability. Once the regression has been carried out, a series of loads of objective memories remains in the INC system, on which the primary psychic process acts until it forms, through its condensation and displacement, the manifest content of the dream. The existing verbal representations among the remains of the day are not treated as verbal representations and subjected to the effects of condensation and displacement, more than when they constitute current and recent residues of perceptions and not an externalization of thoughts. Hence the assertion developed in our dream interpretation and later proven to the evidence, that the words and phrases embedded in the dream content are not newly formed but rather imitate the words spoken on the day immediately after. Previous, or, corresponding to impressions received, during the same, in the reading, conversation, etc. The lack of firmness with which the dream elaboration retains verbal representations is quite singular, always being ready to change some words for others, until finding that expression that offers greater facilities for plastic representation. The decisive difference between dream making and schizophrenia is revealed to us here. In this, the words themselves in which the preconscious idea appears expressed are elaborated by the primary process, while the dreamlike elaboration does not fall on the words but on the objective representations to which they are previously reduced. The dream knows a topical regression. In contrast, schizophrenia, no. In the dream, no obstacle opposes the relationship between the charges, PREC, of the words and the charges, INC, of the objects, a relationship absolutely restricted in the schizophrenia. The dream interpretation diminishes, however, the scope of this difference. By revealing to us, in his interpretive work, the course of the elaboration of dreams, exploring the paths that lead from latent ideas to the elements of the dream, discovering the use of verbal equivocations and indicating the word bridges, stretched between various sectors of the material, makes the dream interpretation an impression that is both humorous and schizophrenic, and leads us to forget that all verbal operations are, for the dream, but a preparation for the regression to objects. The end of the dream process consists in the fact that the ideological content, regressively transformed and turned into an optional fantasy, becomes conscious in the form of sensory perception, a transformation during which it receives the secondary elaboration to which all perception is subjected. We then say that the dream desire is hallucinated, and its fulfillment finds, as such hallucination, complete credibility. This final part of the formation of dreams presents certain obscure points, for the clarification of which we are going to compare the dream with related pathological states. The formation of the optional fantasy and its regression into hallucination constitute the most important elements of dream making, but they are not exclusively peculiar to it. On the contrary, we find them equally in two pathological states, in acute hallucinatory dementia, Maynard's amencia, and in the hallucinatory phase of schizophrenia. The hallucinatory delusion of amencia is a clearly visible optional fantasy, and sometimes as completely ordered as a beautiful daydream. In general, one could speak of an optional hallucinatory psychosis and recognize it both in dreams and in amencia. There are also dreams, which consist only of optional fantasies of ample content and not at all distorted. The hallucinatory phase of schizophrenia has not been as thoroughly studied. It seems to be, generally, of a composite nature, but it could correspond to a new attempt at restitution, which would tend to restore the libidinous charge to the objective representations. The other hallucinatory states that we observe in various pathological conditions cannot be integrated into this parallel, because we lack our own experience of them and it is impossible for us to use that of others. The optional hallucinatory psychosis in dreams or in any other state performs two functions that are not at all coincidental. It not only brings hidden or repressed desires to consciousness, but represents them as fulfilled and finds full credence. It cannot be affirmed that unconscious desires have to be taken as realities once they have managed to become conscious, since our judgment is very capable of distinguishing realities, even from desires and representations as intense as these. Instead, it seems justified to admit that belief in reality is linked to sensory perception. When an idea has found the regressive path that leads to the unconscious memory traces of objects and from them to perception, we recognize its perception as real. Thus, then, hallucination would have regression as its obligatory premise. The mechanism of the latter is easily revealed to us in the dream phenomenon. The regression of the preconscious ideas of the dream to the mnemonic images of things, is revealed to us, in effect, as a consequence of the attraction that these unconscious instinctive representations, for example, the repressed memories of lived events, exert about the ideas concretized in words. But we immediately observe that we are following a false trail here. If the mystery of hallucination were none other than that of regression, any sufficiently intense regression would have to produce a hallucination with a belief in its reality, and we know of cases in which a regressive reflection leads to consciousness very precise visual memory images, which, however, we do not consider a single instant as real perceptions. We could also represent to ourselves that the dream elaboration advances to such memory images, making conscious those that were unconscious and presenting us with an optional fantasy, which we feel pleasantly, but in which we do not recognize the real satisfaction of the desire. The hallucination must therefore be something more than the regressive animation of the memory images in itself. It is of great practical importance to distinguish perceptions from intensely remembered representations. Our entire relationship with the outside world, that is, with reality, depends on this capacity. We have accepted the fiction that we did not always possess it, and that, at the beginning of our mental life, we caused the hallucination of the satisfying object when we felt the need for it. But the impossibility of achieving satisfaction by this means prompted us to create a device very soon, with whose help we were able to differentiate such an optional perception from real satisfaction. Or put another way, we abandoned the hallucinatory satisfaction of wishes and established a kind of reality check. We will now ask ourselves what this examination of reality consists of and how the optional hallucinatory psychosis of dreams and dementia succeed in suppressing it and reconstituting the old form of satisfaction. The answer to this question is revealed to us as soon as we undertake the task of determining in more detail the third of our psychic systems, the CC system, which up to now we have not differentiated with great precision from the PREC system. Already in the interpretation of dreams, we have had to consider conscious perception as the function of a special system, to which we attribute certain qualities and to which we will now justifiably add various other characters. This system, to which we gave the name of the P system, will now be made to coincide with the CC system, on whose work awareness depends. But even so, the fact of consciousness does not completely coincide with belonging to a system, since we have already seen that it is impossible for us to recognize a psychic place in the CC system, or in the P. Postponing the resolution of this difficulty until entering fully into the investigation of the CC system, we will limit ourselves to anticipating the hypothesis that the hallucination consists of a charge of the CC system P, load that is not carried out, as usual, from the outside, but from the inside, and that has as a condition the advance of the regression towards the system, thus ignoring the examination of reality. In previous pages and when dealing with the instincts and their destinies, we admit that the organism, defenseless in its beginnings, could create for itself, through its perceptions, a first orientation in the world, distinguishing an exterior and an interior, by the diverse relationship of these elements with their muscular action. Those perceptions that it was possible for him to suppress by means of a muscular act were recognized as external and real. On the other hand, when such acts proved ineffective, it is because it was an internal perception, which was denied reality. Possession of this means of characterizing reality is extremely valuable for the individual, who finds in it a defense weapon against it and would like to have a similar power against the peremptory demands of his instincts. For this reason, he tries so hard to project to the outside what in his interior is cause for displeasure. This function of orientation in the world through the distinction of a exterior and an interior, we must ascribe it, exclusively, to the system. This system must have a motor innervation, by means of which it checks whether or not perception can be suppressed. Reality testing need not be anything other than this device. For now, we can say nothing more, because the nature and function of the CC they are insufficiently known to us. The examination of reality is part, like the censorship we already know, of the great institutions of the self. Leaving it thus established, we shall hope that the analysis of narcissistic affections will help us to discover other such institutions. On the other hand, pathology already reveals to us how the examination of reality can be interrupted or annulled, a circumstance that is shown to us in amentia or optional psychosis, more clearly than in dreams. Amentia is the reaction to a loss affirmed by reality, but which has to be denied to the self, which could not bear it. In this case, the I interrupts its relationship with reality and removes, from the system of CC perceptions, its charge, or rather, a charge whose special nature will still be the object of investigation. With this withdrawal from reality, its scrutiny is interrupted and fully conscious, unrepressed optional fantasies can enter the system and are recognized as a more satisfying reality. Amentia offers us the interesting spectacle of a dissociation between the ego and one of its organs, precisely the one that served it most faithfully and was most intimately linked to it. That which in alacrity carries out repression, is carried out in sleep, by voluntary renunciation. The state of rest does not want to know anything about the outside world and retracts the charges of the CC, PREC, and INC systems as long as the elements integrated in them obey the desire to sleep. With the lack of charge of the CC system, the possibility of an examination of reality ceases, and the excitations independent of the state of rest, which take the path of regression, will find it free until the CC system, in which they will pass by indisputable facts. The hallucinatory psychosis of early dementia cannot, therefore, belong to its initial symptoms, and will only arise when the patient's I reaches such a decomposition that the examination of reality no longer prevents the hallucinatory process. As far as the psychology of the dream processes is concerned, we conclude that all the essential characteristics of the dream are determined by the condition of the state of rest. Aristotle was right when he said that the dream phenomenon constituted the mental activity of the sleeper. Extending this affirmation, we will say that the dream phenomenon is a residue of the mental activity of the sleeper, allowed by the fact that the establishment of the narcissistic state of rest has not been fully achieved. This does not seem very different from what psychologists and philosophers have always affirmed, but it is based on very different opinions about the structure and function of the mental apparatus. Opinions that present, over the previous ones, the advantage of leading us to the intelligence of the dream phenomenon in all its particularities. Finally, we will consider the significance that a topic of the repression process may have for our knowledge of the mechanism of mental disturbances. In sleep, the subtraction of the psychic load, libido, interest, affects all systems equally. In transference neuroses the charge is withdrawn (PREC), in schizophrenia, that of the INC system, and in amencia, that of the system. End. Metapsychological addition to the theory of dreams. Sigmund Freud.